everybody. Dear Prime Minister, dear Ministers, Professor Sachs, distinguished guests. My name is Claudia Karidis. I'm Vice President of Public Affairs at the American College of Greece, and it is a pleasure for me to welcome you all on our beautiful campus on the occasion of a special event hosting a very special guest. Professor Sachs, we believe it's your first time on our campus, of course, so we are delighted to host you, and we look forward to your presentation. Just a few words about the American College of Greece. We are an independent, non-profit academic institution, the oldest and largest American accredited educational institution in Greece. We were founded 144 years ago in 1875 in Smyrna, Asia Minor. We relocated to Greece after the Smyrna catastrophe in 1923. And since then, we have been located in various locations in Athens. Since 1965, we've been located on this campus. ACG, the American College of Greece, enrolls today more than 5,700 students, served by over 450 faculty members, spanning 3 educational divisions. One is DRE, the one we are here now, which is the largest American college in Europe. The second one, located on the same campus on the other side, is Pierce, which is a leading Greek independent secondary school. And the third division is ALBA, which is our premier independent graduate business school. ACG has had a long history, known to thousands of young men and women who have studied with us, and perhaps known to most of you. Currently, we are in the implementation phase of an ambitious plan to raise over 75 million, aiming at leveraging education, meaning our programs and our academic partnerships, in support of the broader Greek society. In view of our celebration of our 150 years, which will happen in 2025, we are working at gradually launching centers of excellence and new academic initiatives dedicated to supporting key areas that we believe they have the potential to enhance the growth of Greece's economy, areas such as tourism, logistics, technology and digital transformation, shipping, health, and many more. Tonight's event, however, is hosted by the Center of Excellence for Sustainability, a body that was created by a colleague who is with us tonight, Mrs. Marouli, back in 2011, a professor of DRE, a center through which the college has been able to develop and launch a number of sustainability best practices throughout the years, addressing all members of our community, faculty, staff, students, most of all, but also alumni and friends and business partners and all those who visit us on our campus. Under the coordination of the Center of Excellence for Sustainability, ACG is addressing issues such as sustainability focus in academic programs and research, our carbon footprint, energy efficiency of buildings, social impact and contribution to the broader community, diversity, wellness, and enhancement of transparency and accountability in our daily operations, and many more. We address these issues through new academic programs and research projects, awareness-raising campaigns, targeted events, partnerships that we have with the relevant organizations, and a number of initiatives aiming at promoting a more sustainable way of living both on and off campus, and engaging an ever-growing number of our constituents. In this context, at the invitation of Andreas Papandreou and Phoebe Koundouri, who are with us, of course, tonight, in 2018, ACG became a member of the UN SDSN, both the global and the national network. We are proud to be a member. I'm wearing my pin here. And I take the opportunity to commend both Andreas and Phoebe for their excellent work they do in this field, inspiring us to engage in more and more activities. We also had an excellent collaboration last year in the context of co-organizing a symposium on climate change here on campus. We remain committed to continuing enhancing our educational programs and other activities in support of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Solution goals, especially number 4, quality education, and of course number 17, which has to do with partnerships. We are all for that. In closing, in 2017, Professor Sachs, ACG was awarded the Star Silver rating in recognition of our best practices in 4 categories: academics, operation, community engagement and social responsibility, as well as planning and administration. As an academic institution educating the leaders of tomorrow, we are proud to be the only academic institution in Greece that has received such a rating. from the relevant association for advancement of sustainability in higher education. We look forward to Professor Sachs' presentation and to being further inspired and empowered by his words so that we continue down the path of promoting a more sustainable future for all of us. Thank you to the Andreas Papandreou Foundation. Thank you to President and Chairman of the Board, George Papandreou, for having the event tonight, and thank you to Katerina Lambrinou, who had the initial idea to host the event tonight here. Thank you all for coming.
I don't think Claudia had any water, so I used, I'm safe in your journey. Okay. So, a bit in Greek, just a welcome, and then I'll turn to English. Καλησπέρα φίλες και φίλοι. Σας ευχαριστώ όλους για την παρουσία σας. Ευχαριστώ και τον εκπρόσωπο του Προέδρου του ΣΥΡΙΖΑ, τον βουλευτή πρώην Υπουργό Δημήτρη Βίτσα. And now, actually, before I go to English, I would also like to read a letter from Poflina Mata, head of Kinal. Αγαπητέ Γιώργο, με ιδιαίτερη συγκίνηση χαιρετίζω τη σημερινή εκδήλωση προς τιμήν του Ανδρέα Παπανδρέου και ειλικρινά λυπάμαι που λόγω απουσίας μου στο εξωτερικό δεν μπορώ να είμαι κοντά σας. Για όλους εμάς ο Ανδρέας Παπανδρέου, εκτός από ένας σπουδαίος πανεπιστημιακός δάσκαλος, ένας μεγάλος διανοητής και πολιτικός πρωτοπόρος αγωνιστής, υπήρξε ο μεγάλος μας δάσκαλος. Μας ενέπνευσε για τη ζωή που αξίζει να ζούμε και για την πολιτική που αξίζει να αγωνιζόμαστε. Οι ιδέες του, οι αγώνες του και το έργο του αποτελούν ένα πολύτιμο κεφάλαιο, μια πολύτιμη παρακαταθήκη και οδηγό πορείας για ένα μέλλον αξιοπρέπεια. Ευχαριστώ τον Jeffrey Sachs που με τη σημερινή του παρουσία και το πάντα ενδιαφέροντο λόγο του συμμετέχει στην έκφραση τιμής και αναγνώρισης προς ιδρυτή και ηγέτη μας και ταυτόχρονα συμβάλλει και στον προβληματισμό για την οικοδόμηση ενός σύγχρονου κόσμου, διαφορετικού και αισιόδοξου για την πορεία της ανθρώπινης κοινωνίας και του πλανήτη. Εύχομαι καλή επιτυχία από φιλενήματα. So, again, a few more thanks. I would like to thank Katerina Lambrinou, as you heard before, for organizing this, along with the entire group from the Andreas Papandreou Foundation. I would also like to personally thank Claudia Karidis for hosting our Andreas Papandreou Memorial Lecture this year. The American College is a member, as you recently just heard, of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, headed by Jeffrey Sachs, and so we are already collaborating very closely. Given that Jeffrey Sachs will be delivering the lecture, it seems a perfect venue for the occasion. In planning our memorial lectures, we have aimed for distinguished scholars that can shed new light on the work and deeds of Andreas Papandreou. Now, there's another more personal reason why we have focused on revealing Andreas' academic work beyond the fact that it is a critical part of understanding his worldview and values that imbued his political activity. In the later years of his life, in personal conversations we had together, he expressed a disappointment that his academic work was little known in Greece and that no university ever thought of asking him to give a purely academic lecture. Perhaps he was thinking about the calmer days of his life. Says, in fact, perhaps this was also some nostalgia for the quieter life he lost once he entered the roller coaster life of politics. Knowing how often over-politicized and partisan university life can be in Greece, I can imagine why departments may have been worried about inviting Andreas Papandreou when considering him for a lecture. Those opposed to Andreas' political views would think that an academic lecture is an excuse to allow him to win over students or faculty. I can't help feeling that with these memorial lectures, we are trying also to redress that unfortunate underappreciation of his academic work, and the link, of course, with his political theory and thought. All the memorial lectures to date have been from prominent academics who are keenly aware of Andreas's dual life, a man of political action who was also a world-renowned academic economist. This can also be seen from gleaning some of the titles of previous memorial lectures. Nobel laureate Amartya Sen talked about the political element in economic development, while Nobel laureate Kenneth spoke of the role of economic thinking in society. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum talked about the neglect of political emotions. She pointed out that while liberals rely on rational debate, they also need to find ways to draw on people's emotions in defending many of the values that we take for granted. This is particularly timely in the context of rising populism that incites passions that undermine hard-won liberal values. The philosopher, cognitive scientist, and economist Don Ross talked about the economics of addiction and experimental economics. Now, this may surprise some people. What's the connection with Andreas here? As it happened, in 1947, Andreas was one of the first economists to do experiments with colleagues from the psychology department to test how rational individuals actually are. You know, we economists have this tendency of starting assuming that we are perfectly rational. We've overcome this problem, but it took many decades. In fact, for decades, including Andreas Papandreou's work, was ignored, but now experimental and behavioral economics are a key part of modern economics. And historians of economic thought have revisited Andreas' initial work and shown how this was right at the beginning of experimental economics. It's good to note as well that this week's Nobel Prize in Economics went to 3 experimental economists. So you again get a taste of how forward-looking Andreas was. In today's lecture, Jeffrey Sachs will take us back to Andreas' earliest academic work in economics, his PhD dissertation. As far as I know, I don't think this is in the public domain, in fact. So this is probably going to be the first lecture ever on Andreas' PhD. I hadn't read the dissertation for a long time, but I remember that it had something to do with the profit motive and the role of entrepreneurs in the economy. Following the recent statement by the Business Roundtable that firms should not only be maximizing shareholder value, but should also broaden their objective to incorporate stakeholders, I sent a digital copy of my father's PhD to Jeffrey Sachs, and within a couple of days, he came back with the theme of this tribute. I'm delighted and grateful that Jeffrey will be linking my father's earliest forays into economics and the pressing challenges of our day. I now invite my brother first to say a few words about our guest of honor, Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ, Ανδρέα. Καλησπέρα, φίλες και φίλοι. Καλώς ορίσατε στη διάλεξη για τη μνήμη του Ανδρέα Παπανδρέου, 100 χρόνια από τη γέννησή του και σήμερα βέβαια 18 Οκτωβρίου, ακριβώς 38 χρόνια από την εκλογική νίκη του Πασόκ. Good afternoon, dear friends. Today we are honoring Andreas Papandreou. 2019 is 100 years since his birth. And of course the 18th of October today is 38 years since he first became Prime Minister after a major electoral victory of PASOK. But today we are also honored to have with us Jeffrey Sachs. Sonia too. Jeffrey Sachs is a globally acclaimed academic. He became director of the Center for International Development at Harvard in 1998, where he both completed his studies and was a full professor. He then moved on to Columbia University as Professor of Sustainable Development and the Director of the Earth Institute. But academia could not contain him. Motivated for social justice and political change, he has been deeply involved in crisis management, advising leaders around the world. His first stops included Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, and Venezuela, helping several Latin American countries to end hyperinflation and renegotiate their external debt. In Poland, and under emergency conditions, such as thriving black markets, food shortages, hyperinflation, a real political thriller, Professor Sachs stayed up all night to prepare the first comprehensive plan for the transition from central planning to a market democracy. And of course, he has much to say on how the Western community handled two different transitions, that of Poland on the one and that of Russia on the other. His advisory roles have extended to China, India, Japan, and the emerging countries such as in Africa. But today I would like to take this opportunity to publicly thank Jeff for his solidarity with Greece, and of course with my government 2009 and 2011, a time when we had difficult negotiations, and Jeff was often there, up against, again very often, irrational demands from the European Union or the Troika. Jeff, your advice was invaluable, both concerning Greece and, of course, your analysis of the euro crisis. I simply had wished that our partners in the European Union would have listened to you. But it would do injustice to Jeff Sachs if one limited his achievements to academia and policy formation. Over the past years, I have witnessed Jeffrey Sachs transform himself into what one might call an intellectual activist, a fighter, an organizer, a debater, while continuing to be a deep and global thinker. He displays a quiet but forceful passion for social justice as he poses crucial questions to us all, such as how does a global society of inequality, of income, wealth, and power function? Can the poor escape their fate? Can human trust and sympathy, as Andreas was saying earlier, as philosopher Nussbaum was talking about, the emotions, how can trust and sympathy surmount the divisions of class and power? And what happens when the world economy is on a collision course with the physical environment? It is these issues that define Jeffrey Sachs as he travels to Africa for his Millennium Religious projects, or when he promotes a global tax on billionaires to support less developed countries' transition to sustainable economies, or when he advises UN Secretary Generals, 3 consecutive Secretary Generals, Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and today Antonio Guterres. I remember a few years ago, Jeff invited me to a rooftop cafe in New York and told me that Ban Ki-moon had asked him to create a leadership council on sustainability. I gladly accepted his offer to be a member of his team. But what I had never expected is that this team would consistently grow to become a global network, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network of thinkers, activists, politicians, and business persons, all united around the common goal of a sustainable society. It is a tribute to Jeffrey Sachs' incessant and tireless work that today there is a vast resource of human potential, thinking, researching, educating, and acting towards a carbon-free society. Your work, Jeff, has certainly inspired many, amongst them many politicians, progressive politicians who wish to defy the trends of demagoguery, scapegoating, ultranationalism, racism, fearmongers hiding behind their proposals for walls or exits from multilateralism, power-hungry authoritarians, or climate change deniers. We need a greening of politics. Climate justice, where sustainability also means fighting the huge inequalities in our societies. Climate democracy, which means that the transition to a carbon-free society is owned by our citizens through more deliberative and direct democratic practices. And climate education, which need translate into a new ethos of collective responsibility. Many of you may not know this about Jeffrey Sachs, but he is also becoming an activist philosopher. And he has been delving into the debates of the ancient Greeks with his usual, of course, passion. So it was no surprise that on our panel 2 days ago, you, Jeff, suggested that the greening of our politics can find inspiration from our ancient Greek traditions. Justice, Socrates, democracy and its many ancient innovations, and education for citizenship a collective ethos for the ancient city-state. Why not for today's global society? But you rightly put emphasis on the new ethos. The new ethos needed for the sea change we will need to transition to a carbon-free society. Yet, Jeff, you already have become a moral force in this ongoing debate, a crucial debate which will define the fate of humanity. And your leadership, the values you espouse, are exemplary. They have given meaning, created a platform, and have built hope as we struggle globally. You have shown the way for different peoples, different nations, different cultures, who, however, can unite under a banner of a new common ethos for a sustainable planet. You have also suggested that Greece show the way. Well, as we are approaching 200 years of independence in 2021, I believe the best way to honor the memory of my father is to interact with provocative and avant-garde global thinkers that can contribute addressing the challenges that were important to him but are important for today. Where Greece could be a hub for learning and debating these ethical dilemmas, the dilemmas leaders and society will face as we use our powers without hubris, hopefully, towards a new sustainable world. With this challenge in mind, I welcome and thank you, Jeff, for your presence and, of course, your ongoing fight for the good society. I'll close with a few words in Greek, as we have also Greek television, which I'd like to address a wider audience. Δύο προσωπικά λόγια και στα ελληνικά. Το θέμα περιβάλλον. Θυμάμαι τον πατέρα μου, τον Ανδρέα, να έχει βέβαια παρόμοιες ευαισθησίες. Μάλιστα, θυμάμαι να λέει ότι μια αδυναμία στην κριτική του Μάρξ για τον καπιταλισμό ήταν η έλλειψη ανάλυσης για το ζήτημα του περιβάλλοντος. Βέβαια, το 1981, 38 χρόνια πριν, ο Ανδρέας είχε αναγκαστικά άλλες προτεραιότητες. Ήταν το κοινωνικό κράτος, η δημοκρατία και η αυτοδιάθεση, να ανοίξει δρόμους για τους ξεχασμένους μη προνομιούχους. Αυτές οι έννοιες σήμερα δεν μπορούν παρά να συνδεθούν με την αντιμετώπιση της μεγάλης πρόκλησης της κλιματικής κρίσης. Η μετάβαση σε μια κοινωνία χωρίς διοξείδιο του άνθρακος σημαίνει και να πρασινίσει η πολιτική μας. Πώς όμως? Η Ευρώπη πρέπει να γίνει μια πηγή έμπνευσης και παραδειγμάτων υλοποίησης του λεγόμενου Green Deal, ενός συμβολαίου πράσινου αν θέλετε. Πρέπει να γίνει από project ειρήνης σε πρότυπο συνεργασίας για ένα project οικολογικό, ένα green project. Και μαζί η Ευρώπη απαιτείται να υπερασπιστεί τρεις βασικές έννοιες αρχές. Κλιματική δικαιοσύνη. Η μετάβαση σε μια πράσινη κοινωνία πρέπει να ενσωματώνει την κλιματική δικαιοσύνη. Έχουμε τεράστιες ανισότητες στον σύγχρονο κόσμο και δεν μπορεί η μετάβαση να πέσει στους ώμους της μεσαίας τάξης και τους φτωχούς της γης. Κλιματική δημοκρατία, που σημαίνει να γίνει η ιδιοκτησία του πολίτη η μετάβαση αυτή με την συνεχή συμμετοχή του στις αποφάσεις, την αναβάθμιση δηλαδή των δημοκρατικών μας θεσμών πιο συμμετοχικών, πιο άμεσων. Την κλιματική παιδεία, που σημαίνει να δώσουμε τα εργαλεία στη νέα γενιά για αυτή την δύσκολη, αλλά ελπίζουμε όμορφη μετάβαση. Σε νέες μορφές, νέους τύπους κατανάλωσης, νέους τύπους αγορών, νέους τύπους και σχέσεις παραγωγής. Αλλά παράλληλα να καλλιεργηθεί ένα νέο ήθος συλλογικής ευθύνης για τις κοινωνίες μας και τον πλανήτη μας. Έχοντας αυτά στο νου μου, 20 χρόνια πριν, ως Υπουργός Εξωτερικών ξεκίνησα την λεγόμενη περιβαλλοντική διπλωματία. Είναι εδώ ο Τάσος μαζί, τα κουνδιάζαμε. Και μίλησα για την πράσινη ανάπτυξη, έλεγα τότε να γίνουμε η Δανία του Νότου. Μια Δανία που βεβαίως έχει πρωτοπορήσει στις εναλλακτικές μορφές, ανανεώσιμες μορφές ενέργειας. Είναι κρίμα ότι πέρασαν τόσα χρόνια, πολλές φορές και χλευασμού για το θέμα, για να φτάσουμε να μιλάμε σήμερα σοβαρά για την περιβαλλοντική κρίση. Ένα θέμα που πάντα πίστευα και πιστεύω ότι αφορά μεν όλη την ανθρωπότητα, αλλά θα μπορούσε να είναι βασικό στοιχείο της νέας μας ταυτότητας, μιας Ελλάδας διαφορετικής. Ευζοίας, υγιών αγροτικών προϊόντων, σημαντικό για τον Έλληνα καταρχήν, αλλά και για να προσελκύσουμε τον επισκέπτη, δηλαδή υψηλού επίπεδου τουρισμού, δημιουργικής εργασίας μέσω έρευνας και εκπαίδευσης στα θέματα αιχμής της βιώσιμης ανάπτυξης, όπως της ηλιακής, αιωλικής και γεωθερμικής μετατροπής της ενέργειάς μας, δηλαδή να μετατρέψουμε την οικονομία μας σε μια κοινωνία δημιουργίας, στην εργασία και την επιχειρηματική πρωτοβουλία. Χάσαμε χρόνο, γι' αυτό τον λόγο όμως και καθώς συζητούμε τη νέα ταυτότητα της χώρας μας με ορίζοντα το 2021, ας το θέσουμε το ζήτημα αυτό ως πρώτη προτεραιότητα, επιτακτικά για την κοινωνία μας. Για τους παραπάνω λόγους χαίρομαι ότι σήμερα θα μας μιλήσει για το θέμα, τιμώντας τη μνήμη του Ανδρέα, ένας από τους βασικούς διανοητές και ακτιβιστές για την πράσινη ανάπτυξη. Ο Jeffrey Sachs που ήταν, είναι και θα παραμείνει σπουδαίος συνοδοιπόρος σε αυτόν τον αγώνα. Jeff, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, George and Andreas, and for the American College of Greece for hosting this event. And all of you, ladies and gentlemen, I am profoundly honored and very grateful for the chance to give the memorial lecture this evening. George said that he was going to switch from English to Greek, but actually he was speaking Greek all along. When you talk about the economy, when you talk about the ecological crisis, when you talk about the hubris of some of our leaders, when you talk about the paradox of poverty in the midst of wealth, when you talk about the struggle for democratic rule, of course you're speaking Greek in every context. And there is no doubt in my mind that Greece has given more to civilization, to Western civilization, than any other country in history by far. In fact, it still keeps giving. And the contributions of Greece from the days of the marathon until the great classic age of Greece, and especially for me, the beloved philosophers who gave us the concepts that we depend on to find a way to the good life and to understand our politics. The ethics of our life, a very good Greek word. This is a crucial gift, and it is extremely important for you to continue to lead this effort in the years ahead, and I have no doubt that Greece will continue to do so. I'm privileged to be at a wonderful university with a great history, and I felt very privileged yesterday and today to be at a university even longer standing, the Academy, the first ever university in the world. That's not bad. Greece, of course, has the number 1 and 2 schools of history, the Academy and the Lyceum. I understand that the American College has its Lyceum for the upper secondary school, and students in the Lyceum are very lucky. I wish I could study in the Lyceum. We walked around the Lyceum on our visit to Athens this summer, and I just felt excited to think that Aristotle must have walked somewhere along the same path that I was walking, and that tradition continues here. Indeed, one of my themes is that Greece's future, like its past, depends on fostering great universities. This is a private university in a country that doesn't yet really have private universities in general, but I would encourage more of a diversity of organizations, private and public and mixed institutions. And the reason is that this is a country that can lead globally in thinking, and that can attract students from all over the world. If you want to think where would students like to come study, it's hard to imagine a more beautiful, inviting place. And so I hope that the government will foster this kind of diversity of organization and really see the flowering of higher education in Greece as a marvelous opportunity, a growth pole for the economy, a major contribution to society, and I think a major contributor to global solutions. Let me also say how privileged I am to have become part of the Papandreou orbit, one of the satellites of the many satellites circling the Papandreou family, which is a great family of this country's history, but a great family of world history. I knew of your father from a very early age, of course, even because of the news of his arrest and the challenges, the risks that he faced. And then when I got to Harvard, of course, with Kenneth Galbraith, my local hero at the time, and your father, such a close friend of Ken Galbraith, and also, I think, a hero for Ken Galbraith as well. I felt vicariously this connection. And of course, I'm sure that I felt from the very first this marvel of an individual who was at the top of the academic league, hugely esteemed intellect and a pioneer in many areas of economics, entering politics at great danger and then with great success, and ushering in what I regard as the most successful form of governance that we have learned in the last century, social democracy, as the basic ethos that can guide modern capitalist societies in a way that is fair and in a way that is environmentally sustainable. And so that ethic of a mixed economy where government plays its role and the market plays its role that your father ushered into this country, and George, that you continue and continued in your great political leadership here, I think is extraordinarily important. So that is a tremendous privilege. It's also remarkable to be here on many anniversaries. I understand your father's 100th birthday, but also this is to the day the 75th anniversary of your grandfather, Georgios Papandreou, raising the flag in Athens after the government in exile returned to Athens after the defeat and withdrawal of the Germans. And so today is itself an absolutely astounding celebration of a great moment for Greece. But your family seems to have a knack for it because, like you say, same birth date, on October 18, 1981, there's your father celebrating a historic victory, winning 172 seats of the parliament and winning the first of his 3 premierships. So grandfather 3 premierships, your father 3 premierships, and you the first of your 3 premierships, George. So just to put you on notice. But it is a grand day and a wonderful time to celebrate. And I thought that indeed, for such a luminous thinker, a wonderful place to start with Andreas Papandreou is with his PhD dissertation of 1943, which I was absolutely delighted to receive from Andreas and to read and find absolutely scintillating and prescient in its focus and its conclusions. Your father was 24, I think, 23 maybe, when he completed his PhD. So it's also absolutely astounding to contemplate this soaring intellectual rise. But he wrote about the entrepreneurial function and took, as was his wont, a historical, empirical, and conceptual sweeping view of the question of the role of entrepreneurship. When he talked about location and scope of the entrepreneurial function, like a good Greek philosopher, the first part of the dissertation is spent on defining the terms, especially defining what is an entrepreneur and how can we identify it, and then moving into experience. And his methodology in the first part is really Aristotelian and doxa, which is he appeals to the known authorities who he quotes and considers their various definitions of entrepreneurship, their contradictions, their commonalities, and then he comes up with his own definition. And he says the entrepreneur is the innovator. Innovation, on the other hand, is the mother of economic development. So from the start, Andreas Papandreou is interested in economic development, long-term change. And he identifies the underpinning of long-term change in innovation, in technological advance. And he identifies the core role of the entrepreneur is the one who bears the uncertainty of innovating. So some definitions were that the entrepreneur is the boss, some the owner of the enterprise. But Andreas Papandreou gives a functional description. That's why he's talking about the location and scope of the entrepreneur. And it is the one who is able, in the midst of deep uncertainty, fundamental uncertainty, to be able to create positive change, to be able to create innovation. And, in his influence at the time were two very important works. One by Birley and Means called The Modern Corporation and Private Property, which was a very profound sociological analysis of the modern company. And it was the first analysis that talked about the separation of ownership and management of the company, something that became a fundamental theme of every business school in the world in the last 50 years. But Birley and Means talked about the fact that in a modern American corporation, the real management was not from the owners, the shareholders, or from the board, but really from the CEO and the management team. And that separation of ownership and management had many profound implications, and we still deal with those profound implications still today. The other great influence was another scholar activist, Joseph Shoom Hater, who was one of the most important economists of the 20th century as well. Shoom Hater, an Austrian, was prime minister was finance minister in Austria after World War I in the early 1920s. He tried to tame a hyperinflation. The politics overcame Austria, and he left and came to the United States and became a professor at Harvard University, where he would become a major intellectual leader and influence on Andreas Papandreou. It led 50 years later to a quip of John Kenneth Galbraith that Shoom Hater was a failed finance minister who then became a Harvard professor, thus reversing the usual course of things. But Shoom Hater was undoubtedly a great, great thinker. And he really was the thinker who put innovation at the center of thinking. His idea of creative destruction, which is an idea that we hear every day, I think, disruptive technological change, the idea that new sectors bury the old sectors, and that is a fundamental part of technological change, was in his theory of economic development in 1936. And therefore, when Andreas arrived at Harvard, these were the questions that were in the order. What is the nature of the corporation now that it is becoming the fundamental institution of the modern economy? And how does it relate to the question of innovation, which is the fundamental driver of long-term economic change? Well, I'm sure your father was not a shy man intellectually, because he barged right in at the grand old age of 23 to answer the question. And he did a wonderful job in this dissertation. He starts with the definitions, the comparison of received thinking, and then he moves to a long historical account and identifies the entrepreneur as changing nature and focus in the course of 600 years of history, which he covers. He starts with the merchants and the merchant fairs of Europe, which he identifies as the early entrepreneurs, that the first entrepreneurs were entrepreneurial in introducing new trading networks. Again, I think the Greeks got there earlier, probably 2,000 years earlier, in the trading networks in the Aegean and in the Mediterranean. But in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, it was the merchant traders who established and reestablished new trade links also within Europe and between Europe and Asia. And this is where Papandreou puts the first entrepreneurship in the second millennium. Then he goes on to the Industrial Revolution, where it is owner-managers. The owners run their firms. They establish their firms, they run their firms. Like Boulton and Watt. James Watt invented the steam engine. He and his partner Boulton opened the first company that made and sold steam engines, and they were owner entrepreneurs together. And then he takes this to the 20th century and does an extended empirical analysis. Very impressive. He gets data for several hundred of the largest American companies and analyzes where the real locus of management lies. Is it with an owner? Is it with a board? Or is it with the management team of a publicly traded company? So it's an extensive body of empirical work and original empirical work. And he concludes that Berle and Means have the right idea, because most of the major American companies are not owner-managers. They are rather with separation of ownership and management. But then for me, I think perhaps the most significant forward look was his observation, and I think it is very much already an early stage of his political thinking as well, that in the future he surmises the state will play the role of entrepreneur much more. So you see, he's focusing on a function, how to innovate. But then he's noticing throughout history, this is not a simple answer, and it's not a static answer. It's a changing answer. So if it's merchants, then owners, then modern corporations, the state, he says, will come to play a more important role. And this is absolutely correct on several levels, and I think extremely prescient and extremely important precisely for our topic of sustainable development. It's also notable and remarkable that Andreas Papandreou was at the birth of the post-war era, also as a young man. He was at the Bretton Woods Conference, which established the IMF and the World Bank, as an economic advisor to the Greek delegation. And he was at the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. And we should note that the UN came into existence on October 24, 1945, so we're also celebrating a crucial anniversary, 74 years of multilateralism this week. Next year will be the 75th anniversary of multilateralism, It hangs in the balance now. Our lives depend on it. We have to make the UN work. We should be thinking about how to help explain and celebrate the role of the UN for our students, for young people, because one of the most important challenges that we're going to face, that they are going to face, is to make the UN work. And especially in this transition where the US is no longer a global leader, it is more a global provocateur than a leader. We need a different base of multilateralism, but the UN remains our chartered global organization that absolutely must work. And it was notable for me that Andreas Papandreou was at the founding of the United Nations, and I'm sure that that also shaped his view. Both the Bretton Woods institution and the UN are sovereign member state institutions. So they empower states. The states are the members. They are the voting members of both bodies. And I think that this also means that focusing on the state role in the modern economy is an idea very much strengthened by both of these global functions. Now, I want to say a word about the methodology of Andreas Papandreou, because I think it's extremely important. He's questioning all the time. Socratic in the questioning, Platonic in trying to find some core ideal forms, but then definitely Aristotelian in the end, in looking at the empirical evidence and making a discernment based on what the data showed. And from the beginning, not only does he have that philosophical outlook, but it also leads constantly to a questioning about mainstream economics. So I think it's fair to say that from the very start, you see an extremely active, deep thinker facing a lot of the frustrations of the field of mainstream economics. He wants it to tell truths. He wants those truths to be empirically grounded. He doesn't want it to be an empty tautological field where there are some mathematical theorems stated that then are proved and that that's the end of the story. And he also doesn't believe the idea that one can make up any introspective idea, analyze the logical implications of that, and then declare that as a basis for policy or for prediction. And so one of the main points that he makes as early as 1950 is the idea that economics should be part of an integrated, overlapping, interdisciplinary approach to the human sciences. And he says that this procedure calls for a careful inventorying of all of the tentatively valid propositions of psychology, anthropology, and sociology in an effort to equip economics with the tools necessary to impose restrictions upon the formal relations among economic variables in order that operationally meaningful hypotheses may be formulated. So this is 70 years ago. He's talking about integrating psychology, anthropology, and sociology. We're still struggling to do that. And as Andreas said a few minutes ago, when his father went from his Harvard assistant professorship to University of Minnesota, one of the ways that he wanted to implement this was not only to speak with psychologists, but to do experiments to see whether the psychology works. So he did the first experiments in the psychology of economics. Now this is a boom industry. And I did not know that also, but it's amazing to see back in 1950, 51, 52, studying our tastes really transitive. If you prefer something to something else, and you prefer that something else to a third thing. You prefer the first thing to the third thing. That's transitivity of pace. It's an axiom of decision theory in economics, but for Andreas Papandreou, he didn't want axioms. He wanted to know, is this true? Can we rely on this as a field? So he did empirical tests of this very early on. Unfortunately, this is not the way the field went for 40 years. The field went the way of Milton Friedman, deductive, reductionist, and assuming that markets would solve all problems almost axiomatically. And Milton Friedman posed a different methodology, which he called positivist methodology. His methodology said it doesn't matter what your assumptions are as long as the predictions that come from them are reasonable or useful, that's good enough. It's nonsense. It's a very toxic idea that you don't have to analyze your assumptions, you just have to study the predictions, because even if the predictions work well for a moment, if the assumptions are not good, those predictions are not going to be useful for the longer term. And Andreas Papandreou writes several papers in the 1950s on the question of prediction, and he basically concludes in a paper in Science magazine, the world's premier science journal in 1959, that economists cannot predict anything, he says. It's a formal, vacuous field, disconnected from empirical realities. And even if you have a logical formal structure, it doesn't connect to underlying empirical reality. Well, I've gone back also to look at several of Milton Friedman's articles and ideas, because I was very much affected by them. Not that I was a follower, but he was a leading, influential voice when I entered the study of economics in 1972. And it's amazing how many things he got badly wrong, but not just badly wrong, I would say dangerously wrong. I put one of them here in this idea of not having to worry about the assumptions. He takes on one of the themes of Papandreou, which is that markets are not really competitive. These are big companies and they have market power, something rather evident for our economies. And Milton Friedman says in this essay, it doesn't matter. Assume that they're competitive, get the predictions from that, that will work well. That's a form of what he calls positivist economics. And one of the things he says is that the theory of monopolistic competition, which Andreas Papandreou was pursuing, offers no tools for the analysis of an industry, and so no stopping place between the firm at one extreme and general equilibrium at the other. It is therefore incompetent to contribute to the analysis of a host of important problems. The one extreme is too narrow to be of great interest, the other too broad to permit meaningful generalizations. For a specialist, this is a very interesting statement, because it is dead wrong. It turned out that in the next 50 years, the study of monopolistic competition fundamentally changed how we understand international trade, fundamentally, and gave a Nobel Prize to Paul Krugman, among others, for that work, fundamentally changed how we understand intellectual property and its derivation, and it gave a Nobel Prize to Paul Romer last year for that work. And the empirical statement here that you could not learn from this was profoundly falsified. No, in 1953, when Friedman wrote this, it was true, but those who persisted to know we have a lot of monopolistic competition, we really ought to understand this better, ended up making the breakthroughs to allow better assumptions to inform better understanding of the basic drivers of international trade and intellectual property and fundamentally innovation. So I thought that was an interesting example of where Papandreou was right and Milton Friedman, who came to dominate the field, really got it wrong. What were Papandreou's intellectual operating principles? I would say at least 5 were central. First, that the economy is dominated by large firms with market power, what we call monopolistic competition. Second is the core role of innovation under uncertainty in a modern economy. A third idea is the need to harmonize social forces. And this is the idea that leads him to become a social democrat as prime minister of this country and in the philosophy of PASOK. And as I said, while there are challenges of every kind of political framework, if one views European history of the 20th century and in the early years of the 21st century, I would say the social democratic framework has hands down proven its worth and its mettle and its ability to adjust to changing times. That is the 4th point. And the 5th point is, as he already started to think in 1943, the role of the state as an innovator and as an entrepreneur in the society. Now, that idea of the state as entrepreneur came to pass, and it came to pass especially in the United States, and it really was the reason for the U.S. remarkable economic success in the second half of the 20th century. Unfortunately, this is not well understood in the United States itself. But the formative document, probably the single most important document of economic strategy in the United States, is this pamphlet, Science, the Endless Frontier. Not even an economics paper, but a paper by the science advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt did something absolutely extraordinary in 1944 that one can't even imagine today, but so breathtaking in its insight. It's a reason I regard Franklin Roosevelt, it's one of the many reasons I regard Franklin Roosevelt as the finest American president in American history. I think by a long way, by the way. What Roosevelt did in the fall of 1944 is ask his science advisor a question. He said, we have developed a phenomenal amount of science during the war. Nuclear science, obviously, was going to lead to the atomic bomb soon enough. Radar, semiconductors, cybernetics, which was invented during the war. Information theory would come out of World War II, the beginnings of solid-state physics, and so forth. And Roosevelt asked a question which is the opposite of what most heads of state would ask. A normal head of state would ask, how do we keep this precious science secret for American security? Roosevelt asked exactly the opposite question. He asked Vannevar Bush, his science advisor, how do we make this military science known for the broader public so that it can help to fuel the civilian economy after the war? What a wonderful idea. And he produced, in response, Bush produced this scintillating volume, very short, and I recommend to anyone to read it because it's the quintessence of excellent policy advice. Vannevar Bush says we need science-based development after World War II. What does that mean? We need the government to play a leadership role in science. This was something new in peacetime. In war, it was understood. After all, Leonardo da Vinci was constantly giving new military ideas in his sketches, and battering rams and ramparts and winches and everything else. So the kings and the princes had always asked the engineers and the artists to create technology, but this was for peacetime. And Vannevar Bush argued for massive public funding of science, of the National Science Foundation, of the National Institutes of Health, of biomedical research, of funding for higher education. And so this, to my mind, invented the post-World War II economy. We like to think, well, not we, but Milton Friedman and others like to continue to describe the US economy as a free market economy, as a capitalist economy, as the invisible hand. But the truth was, it was a very visible hand. It was government supporting the development of one sector after another: public health, modern medicine, obviously space science with the moonshot, solid-state physics with integrated circuitry, with the transistor and its applications, computer science, which was heavily funded by the US government from the very start, nanotechnologies, and environmental sciences all found their start and their amplification through the role of the state. So this, I would say, is a vindication of Papandreou's vision that the state would become entrepreneur. And that was not to be taken as a simple proposition. This was a breakthrough, and the United States really launched that. We don't get it now. Of course, we have the most anti-scientific president we've ever had in our whole history. There are a lot of Greek words that come to mind. One is akratia, which is, you probably know, but we have a man that cannot control his impulses or his tweets from one moment to the next. Aristotle had some good advice. First, don't become acratic, and certainly don't hire an acratic individual as president. This is absolutely sound advice, which I'm trying to help implement with some urgency for the next round of our politics. Now, under science-led development, we have had a remarkable 75 years on the planet. Many dozens of wars, but thank God not a cataclysm, though we came close many times. And I would say in that 75 years of science-based global development, 6 important themes can be mentioned quickly. One is the increasing role of intellectual capital in all economic development in all parts of the world. More training, higher education, technological-based development. It is precisely the Shoom Hater Papandreou vision of innovation as the absolute core driver of development. Second is the increasing concentration of intellectual property. We have a few companies now that amass the preponderance of the income earned on the internet. Of course, Amazon and Google, Facebook, a few companies worth about $3.5 trillion of market capitalization today. This again is a Papandreou-esque reflection of the role of market power, sometimes backed by patents, sometimes backed by the increasing returns to scale of network functionality that have given dominance, winner take all, or winner take almost all, power to a few large companies. Very weird when Mark Zuckerberg was down the hall from your daughter and now he runs the world. And it does not make me feel very safe. He was not someone I would have wanted to run the world a few years ago, and it's someone I don't want to run the world now, but he's got several billion people depending on Facebook and our political systems vulnerable to what happens. And for all his musings about this, this is too much power for one person. Aristotle would have said so, Papandreou would have said so, and Sachs is saying so today, for whatever that is worth. The third is the intense and massive globalization of trade, finance, and investment. We are profoundly, deeply intertwined. Trump is trying to create a new Cold War between China and the United States. It won't work. It's a disastrous idea. The connections are far too deep and strong and beneficial, I might add, to think in these terms, but a lot of damage is certainly possible. Unfortunately, a fourth trend is the intertwining of science and the military. So almost everything we produce of value scientifically is grabbed by the Pentagon, and our big tech firms are pulled into Pentagon contracts and writing code for the Pentagon and so forth. Very, very bad dynamic. It's something, again, that your father would have worried very much about, because he was very much worried about the dangers to American democracy of the military-industrial state, and he knew the costs of that firsthand. And this, unfortunately, has become even more true today. A fifth point, of course, is the rise of Asia, and especially China, in innovation. In patent applications in the last year, China is now almost 50% of the world's patent applications. There is a remarkable surge of innovation and intellectual activity. Anyone who thinks that China is just stealing Western ideas doesn't get it. Just read any weekly issue of Nature or Science, and you'll see articles at the cutting edge of science and technology pioneered by Chinese scholars, which are now some of the finest universities in the world. My advice, partner with China, absolutely, as a critical part of Greece's well-being and a natural way in a world where information should flow. And finally, I would say, because of the scale of economic activity, because of the nature of technology, nothing can be done by one individual country alone in the great challenges of development, still less in the challenges of sustainable development. That means that regional integration is more essential than ever. And that's why Greece's fate is Europe's fate, and Europe's fate is Greece's fate. And the two are completely intertwined. And any populist politician in Europe who believes that there is a way forward without a strong Europe simply does not understand the underlying forces of technology, economy, security, energy, ecology that are vital for us today, because not one of them can be addressed by any one individual country alone. And it's also, I should say parenthetically, why it is so harmful for the old divide et impera philosophy of the Roman Empire, replayed by the United States, that divide and conquer is a suitable strategy. The US wants in every region countries divided. Okay, Saudi Arabia, you're on our side, Iran's on the other side. Or Europe, we're on this side, Russia's on the other side. Or in Asia, China's on the other side, Japan and Korea are on our side. This kind of thing, even President Obama tried to sign a trade agreement in Asia without China. What could he have been thinking? What kind of idea is that? The idea that you have 1.4 billion people and you don't talk to them because we are the United States of 325 million people? It's a preposterous notion. We don't need divide and conquer. We need regions where countries are friendly with their neighbors. This is essential. This is Greece and Turkey. This is Iran and Saudi Arabia. This is Pakistan and India. This is Japan and China. We need cooperation, because you cannot solve ecological problems. You can't solve the problems of the Mediterranean. You can't solve the problems of renewable energy. You can't solve the problems of pollution. You can't solve the problems of disease control without cooperation with the neighborhood. And so this is a quite fundamental point, I would say. Now, the result of the way we have managed the world in the last 75 years is a lot of wealth, but a massive shortfall in economic justice and a dramatic crisis in the environment. More monopolization, more income going to capital, more wealth at the top, economic inequality, and a neglect of the ecology. And I would say Aristotle would not have approved. His whole point in the Nicomachean Ethics was that an excessive pursuit of wealth will not lead to eudaimonia. It will lead to an addiction to wealth. It will lead to an instability of society. It will lead to a collapse of democracy. By the way, Nikitas Pittas is my tutor and guide in this, so if I get it wrong, blame him. No, not really. He's a wonderful, wonderful scholar and was a wonderful guide as we talked about Aristotle this past summer with a group of us together, and with Phoebe and Andreas and George. But Aristotle would have told you right from the beginning, the ultimate goal is not wealth, the ultimate goal is a good life, and in good Aristotelian fashion you would say moderation. Wealth, yes, but don't destroy the environment. Don't lead to massive injustice. Don't destroy the middle class. And that is really what brings us to the challenge of the Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals were adopted by all 193 UN member states precisely because the world economy is not functioning in a balanced way. Precisely because we cannot go on the way we are going right now. We can create lots of wealth, but we will destroy the social ties through inequality, and we will destroy the ecological underpinnings of our civilization if we continue longer in the direction that we're going. So the world adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they are, in my view, an expression of the social democratic ethos, in not the political party sense, but in the broader ethical sense. Moderation, an attempt to combine, and a need to combine economic prosperity, of course, with social inclusion and with environmental sustainability. And they call for massive transformations of our society, but achievable ones. Education, quality education for all, health for all, zero carbon energy and circular economy, sustainable land use, smart cities and sustainable transport, such as sustainable shipping, and the use of smart digital technologies in the right way that allows for privacy, that prevents the intrusion of the state, that doesn't descend into cyber warfare, but provides tools for a better life. The group that I lead, this wonderful school and the wonderful work that Phoebe and Andreas and George help on with SDSN, this SDSN produces every year a global scorecard, a report card of how countries are doing. And Greece's scorecard is okay, but not so great. Of course, this has been a difficult period, and I know, because we've been meeting all the wonderful government officials these past few days and over the summer, there is a tremendous, tremendous determination in this country to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Prime Minister Mitsotakis is completely committed to them. The Environment Minister is completely committed to them. The R&D Minister is completely committed to them. And this is extremely important because this is an all-of-country effort, and the government is absolutely ready to lead on this. And so I thought it would be worthwhile to say a word about what some of the big challenges are. I would put at the top of the list educational quality. Not that it's a disaster, but strive for the best. Because right now, on the comparative scores, Greece does not do so well, especially in the technical skills, in the STEM education. So in the PISA rankings, which are the international comparison rankings, Greece came out 43rd out of 72 ranked countries. That's not good enough. This country can do better. And investing in wonderful institutions such as this one, a major effort of upgrading the universities, the teachers' colleges, and education, all the way from pre-K through upper secondary, I believe is the top priority. Second, more women in politics. Because Greece rates are rather low on this, only 18% according to the date. I don't know whether that's absolutely the most recent, but it is not high enough. Third is innovation. Greece is not patenting at the rate per population that it could be, because there is real expertise here. There needs to be a startup culture. We discussed this with the Minister of Research and Development yesterday. The idea of creating clusters around universities and leading research institutions is the right idea. Europe as a whole needs a much larger investment in R&D. I'll show you that in a moment. And Greece needs to play a major part of that. The fourth is income inequality. Greece's income inequality remains quite high. And I think that the idea, of course, of watching that level of income inequality and taking policies of social protection and fair taxation so that the income and quality education, all of which would drive the income inequality lower over time, is extremely important. Renewable energy and circular economy is a must for every country. This country needs to do better in that. You have so much sunshine. I would say the nicest sunshine I know in the world. Where else do you want to be in the sun but in Greece? But put a solar panel underneath it and then ship it to Berlin, which is gray and dark, by the way. And so they should not be building so much solar power. You should be shipping the electrons to Germany. And I think that a European-wide renewable energy grid is extremely important. Circular economy means clean up after yourself. This is one of my wife's many complaints about me, but she's very effective at getting me to put the right thing in the right recycling bin. In fact, of course, the Mediterranean is being massively polluted, devastatingly polluted. We have a new directive on plastics. It has to be made to work. There are many creative innovations on stopping the plastics pollution in this country, and please lead on this because it's extraordinarily important. Finally, ICT-enabled development. 5G is coming fast. Get on with it. It is definitely a core part of the solutions and a core part of the competitive advantages. I think that this is something not to wait. So what are some of the implications for Greek strategy? First, a strong European Union framework. We have a new European Commission. This is the time to push for really an investment-led, sustainability-led development for Europe in the 2020s, and a much larger spending on investment for sustainability. George pushed this case very hard during his prime ministership. Mr. Schäuble in Germany was not listening. Germany has never quite figured out macroeconomics, and I'm afraid that that remains the case now. But Germany doesn't have to be the final arbiter of this. Greece and Italy and Spain and other countries need to play a strong voice and strong role within European decision-making, and I think that this is possible. Second, a major scale-up of renewable energy in an EU-wide context. Third, Greece is an innovation hub built around its universities and research institutions. Incubate new startups. Universities as the places for integrated thinking and cutting-edge development. And fourth, as a development strategy, Greece as a global hub for higher education, healthcare, transport, and of course, culture. You have all the reasons to be the global hub. Where else? Yeah, Italy's nice too, by the way, a lot of history. But yours is older, and they took a lot of your ideas. So I think that even the Roman Empire basically took Greek philosophy. It never invented its own. So you have a big claim to being a or the global hub of culture and higher education. But it does mean education reform, so that the schools can flourish, so that there can be new and innovative ways for financing, so that students from all over the world can come to enjoy this country, learn in this country, imbibe the spirit of the country, imbibe the history, learn about Aristotle and Plato and the ancient beauty and the archaeology. And I think that this is absolutely, and to eat the most healthy diet in the world. So healthcare is also an obvious way forward. Remember, the other regions are doing this. What freaked out the United States is China surging ahead technologically. They're not doing anything wrong, they're doing it just right. They're doing in 2015 what the United States started in 1945. Science-based development with the strong hand of the central government. That's not cheating. That's just the US saying, what the heck do you think you're doing? That's our business, not your business. You're supposed to assemble our parts. And China has a different idea, which is they want to be leaders in these industries. Good for them, because they're going to make a lot of innovations and it's going to spur their economy. And of course, the United States is not really a free market economy by any means. And even under Mr. Trump, we have a new executive order for maintaining American leadership in artificial intelligence. If there's any president that knows about artificial intelligence, it must be Mr. Trump. And so he made a decree, but it shows that this is a natural way for governments to act. If you look at where Europe is right now, the United States, this is 2015 data, invested $535 billion in R&D. East and Southeast Asia, $721 billion. Europe in third place, still big, $415 billion, but increasing. Really needs a major spur of home-led R&D across the board. This is what Horizon Europe is to be about. It's the successor of Horizon 2020. But take what is on the books for Horizon Europe and double it, at least. Because this is really Europe's lifeline for competitiveness and for sustainable development. Cooperate with China. This is the Belt and Road Initiative. You know it well. Athens is right there as one of the points, the port of Piraeus. Good for you. This is, of course, the right thing to do. But what we need is Brussels understanding this as well. The United States is saying, don't talk to them, we want a Cold War with China. But Europe should be saying, we want to cooperate. We share the same landmass. We share Eurasia. And it is my thought that Europe should be investing here in sustainable development and going towards the east. China is funding investment going towards the west. And why not meet in Tbilisi? Because I think that this is what we need, is a Eurasian-wide sustainable development. Fast rail on electricity, 5G interconnectedness with Huawei if they're the cheapest, fastest, best providers, not blacklisting a company just because they're ahead, but using the technologies that come because they are actually ahead. And I think that by making that partnership, we can help to green China, because China is a dirty, polluting country. It wants to get out of that. It needs Europe's partnership to make the Belt and Road Initiative and to make its own transformation internally sustainable. So I see this as a wonderful opportunity. Our network, and I'm so thrilled to have the fantastic partners of George and Andreas and Phoebe and Nikitas and many, many friends and colleagues in this room, is a worldwide network of universities we really see the Greek chapter of SDSN not just as another chapter, but as really a hub. Because there's so much dynamism here, it has become the hub for the Black Sea region. It's become a hub for the Mediterranean basin. It has been a progenitor of now a 4 seas network: the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Aral Sea. So we're really extending across Eurasia in exactly the right way, I think. And so this network is at your disposal, but please keep leading. You're running fast. We will run as fast as we can to keep up and to support all of the great leadership here. Finally, let me say, in order to accomplish this, we need great thinking, we need intellectual leadership, we need integrative knowledge. Now, Aristotle knew just about everything that was known at the time, so that is one model that is beyond just about anybody in our age today. We need a different kind of integration where we have collegiality. My understanding of the Greek word for university is panepistemio, which I love because it means knowledge of everything, every science. And that is a beautiful idea. Knowing the Greek root is even better than saying universe, because university doesn't quite express it. The idea is there, but panepistemio really expresses what we're after, which is all knowledge in an integrated manner. And as I said at the beginning, and I want to say at the end, the Greeks arrived at this conclusion first around 350 BC with the Academy and the Lyceum. And the flourishing of thinking that still astounds us 2,300 years later. How could any flowering have been so great and so fundamental? And you invented this idea. And I want to close with the observation of Andreas Papandreou, again back in 1950, on this about my own field and own profession, because he said it perfectly and exactly to the point. The maxim that the economist of our day should observe, is open-mindedness towards the achievements of the other social sciences. The future of economics as an empirical science may well depend on the degree to which our generation of economists are willing to live by it. So these are words to live by. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me now? Okay. First a word of ένα ευχαριστώ για τον εκπρόσωπο του Πρωθυπουργού, του Πρόεδρου της Νέας Δημοκρατίας, Υπουργός Ανάπτυξης Άδωνη Γεωργιάδης εδώ. And back to English again. I really thank you for an amazingly inspiring speech, linking with my colleague's intellectual work and the present challenges of this world make it very special and touching to me. And I think your vision and your thoughts are inspiration to all of us. And I think we learned a lot, as we always do, listening to you. Now, we have an opportunity here for questions from the audience. I'm sure there are a lot of things that this particular presentation and lecture raised, many issues. So please, anyone who wants to ask something, whether it's there, please.
Shall I just use my voice and project?
We have a microphone.
Thank you very much for a most inspiring lecture. And what I liked best of all was
no divide and rule, everyone together cooperate, and with China, because they're really leading, especially with this new road all the way to, I think it's Rotterdam. But what I would like, perhaps your idea would be, how is social democracy going to deal with this taking over of most things by robots? What happens to all those workers? I got really depressed at the airport the other day, seeing us, the travelers, having to do all the work with the machines. I don't want that. It was terribly lonely, and I kept asking the people working there, you must be losing a hell of a lot of jobs here. Have you got an answer to that, perhaps, or some suggestion as to how to cope with this advancing of robots taking over people's jobs? And just one very more, I think I'll stop there, give a chance to somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take another question before Jeff answers. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I really enjoy your comparison between US and China. One thing I would like to ask you is the US economy and the startups and the companies, they flourished in the 50s and 60s thanks to the incredible amount of democracy and capital. China today, I haven't seen much capital going around, and in terms of democracy, is way back. So do you think that China can compete US in terms of development of new businesses and growth based on the current political situation?
One more question before we get a reply, please.
Allow me to make an entrepreneurial question. I'm an entrepreneur, and I think that if we see the absolute number of investment in R&D, sure, Europe is the third one, but I don't think it's the right metrics. Because if you see what percentage revenue comes from the patents, and how percentage come from the startup, and what percentage come from the high impact startups, I think we're much lower. So the real question here is, we're doing investment, but we're not doing it the right way as Europe. So that's an important issue. How we're going to bring to change this situation. So what I'm going to do next week, I'm a member of the Chinese-Greek Chamber of Commerce, so I'm traveling to Shenzhen, and I'm going to activate how we're going to bring together the Greek startup ecosystem with the China. So I think it will be extremely important for us, because in Greece, I think it's a one-way street to deliver development through the high-impact startups, and see how we're going to be based on patents and develop revenue on patents. This is, I think, mainly needs a culture change in our country. And of course in Europe, but we're even worse than the rest of Europe on that.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Great. Oh, one more? Okay.
Hello, Professor Sachs. We're very honored to have you here in Greece. 10 years ago, in academic university here in Greece, no one was talking about the sustainability and the sustainable issues. When I'm a candidate, a PhD candidate in the University of Papandreou, and it's about sustainable development internship, Greek internship. But when we were introducing this subject to the university, no one knew about it. And I'm very proud that George Papandreou was introducing these issues in his governance 10 years ago. And I want to tell you, and I want to ask you, what do you propose to Greek universities to do about the issue of sustainability? I think that every university, despite his direction, should do something about this. And what do you propose that young people would be inspired about this?
Thank you. Wonderful questions. Okay.
Sorry, just to add about arms, what are we going to do about them? Because with arms, we'll always have wars, and that's what we want to stop.
Good. Okay. I think the important point for all of us is we really do face an ecological emergency. It's not a small thing that we're facing. We're at the tipping points of biodiversity, of climate change, of mega pollutants that could prove absolutely devastating. We've already reached globally annual costs from climate-related disasters on the order of about $500 billion a year. The United States has been losing $150 billion a year on average to hurricanes, droughts, forest fires, floods. This is big stuff. And of course, those numbers only hint at what can come. Because what the scientists are really worried about is not only the high running costs of forest fires like you suffered, the droughts, the Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes, but runaway processes of collapse. The climate could run away from us because when we reach a certain level of warming, the glaciers in Antarctica, the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland will disintegrate, at least partially. We will have a release of massive amounts of methane and carbon dioxide in the tundra, and there are many other feedback effects that could tremendously amplify and endanger the planet. And my climate science colleagues believe that these thresholds are very close, which is why we set in the Paris Climate Agreement a statement, and it's interesting, in 2015 the statement said keep warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and aim for below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I gave a press conference that day, what a wonderful agreement, and my colleague who knows a lot more climatology than I ever will, James Hansen, who was the lead NASA scientist for 30 years on climate, gave a press conference the same day, said, what a disaster. Doesn't the world know we can't go anywhere near 2 degrees and be safe? Well, the IPCC issued the report last year of why 1.5 degrees is absolutely the farthest we can go. And the world governments, rhetorically, except for the United States, have said, okay, our target is 1.5 degrees. We have to stick to that. And what Hansen says, and I'll come to the point of all of this in a moment, what Hansen says is at 1.5 degrees, we're likely to be building in an 8-meter sea level rise. You can imagine the devastation of that. So he's saying we can't stop at 1.5, we have to reverse by reabsorbing the greenhouse gases in the second half of the 21st century, because we can't sit at this temperature, will lead to utter disaster. The reason I say all of this is that the idea of conventional statecraft, that we're fighting for influence, that we're going to have another Cold War, why don't we have another arms race and so forth, is especially absurd. It's always been absurd, by the way, but it's really absurd now, because not only does it court disaster, and we came close to complete disaster so in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, just within the nearest miss of global annihilation. But now we actually have something to do together that we have to do. which is in the next 30 years decarbonize the world energy system, change the transport system, invest in sustainability in the agricultural value chains, and so forth. So all of this means that the urgency of avoiding an arms race, of putting sustainability into the top priorities of the universities and so forth, fits the times, not just because it's a nice idea, it's a needed idea. So we need to reorient ourselves this way. Mrs. van der Leyen, the new president of the Commission, won her job by the speech to the Parliament saying, okay, we're going to do exactly that. She said we're going to have a European climate law within the first 100 days. We're going to have a European sustainable investment law. We're going to put the SDGs into the European semester process, meaning that each government will be reviewed on its SDG policies and processes. So count on this as being part of our lives going forward. In the United States, our politics became, to use another good Greek word, plutocratic over the past 25 years. We just corrupted democracy by a Supreme Court ruling that said, again, misunderstanding the role of the company, saying companies are individuals, they're persons, so they have free speech, so they can anonymously give campaign contributions. Are you kidding? That's our Supreme Court. By the way, with the idea led by the man who was the advisor to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Lewis Powell, who individually did more to destroy American democracy than just about any individual I know, by putting money at the center. So now we have political cycles that are $6 to $8 billion cost right now. Well, think of how corrupt that is. That's what has gotten us into the trap. We also have a crazy president, to use another good Greek word, psychopathic. That's an added feature. But even before that, we had the corruption. That is really our problem. But stay away from that, because we don't have time to lose. And in the United States, we are fighting back, actually. There really is a political movement underway, and we have a very good chance, actually, of getting out of this craziness, and which we have to do. What is China's prospect? One basic idea of economics, and one basic idea of political culture, and then one more idea. A basic idea of economics, at least since the 19th century, actually goes back to Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List. So Alexander Hamilton in the late 18th century and Friedrich List in Germany in the 19th century, is if you're catching up, there are distinctive institutions that are different from if you are a leading country. So China's been in a catching up mode. And to catch up is not the same thing as to be the technology leader. It's not surprising that China used a more statist approach for catching up. This has throughout history been true, that the role of the state has been always stronger in the catching up phase. How China will move now for the next 50 years is an open question, by the way. China uses the word democracy a lot. China says we want to democratize. But do think of the second proposition, which is that political cultures are deep. China has had a centralized administrative state for most of 2,241 years, since Emperor Qi Huangdi unified the state in 221 BC. Since then, there has been an administrative state with an emperor. And of course, the People's Republic is basically the same administrative structure as traditional Chinese dynasties. So this tradition goes back very, very far. But China has also opened up in lots of ways. And if you want to know about the open-endedness, my third point about China's future, just ask Chinese. They don't know either. For China, this is a new experiment in governance in the same way it is for everybody else. What China does know, by the way, is that from 1839 to 1945, China was abused by the outside world. Britain, fought a war to make China open to narcotics trade. Just about the most cynical war of modern times, the Opium Wars, the 2 Opium Wars. And the United States joined in and destabilized the country, and of course the Japanese invaded. So China's resistance to outside interference and to disorder within China is deeply seated, because the 150 years from 1839 to 1949, and I would say to 1978, were terrible period for China, actually. A disaster. China became an impoverished country from having been one of the world leaders for 2 millennia. And so China wants to catch up. It's a proud civilization, an ancient civilization, a great civilization, and it wants to catch up. We should give it time without creating an enemy. That's it. And we should say there's a room for cooperation. You signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights just like we did, so we expect that we all move in the same direction. I think it's a fair expectation. But we shouldn't put a hostile approach to China. That is absurd. That is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by the way, the United States is hostile to China. It's not a reaction to China, it's hostility. And the reason is simple, that China has the audacity to be doing well. Because by being a country of 1.4 billion people, as soon as China reached a certain level of income, the economy is the same size as the US. From an American point of view, that is unacceptable. That's the trouble with America's mindset, the so-called exceptionalism idea. And so I wrote a book last year, which you might be interested in, called A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism, because I argued the problem is in our head, mostly. We have a foreign policy doctrine that says the United States has to be the most powerful country in every region of the world. That's not a goal for a country. That's a goal for an empire. And it's not a pleasant goal. It doesn't improve the quality of life. It endangers the world. So we need a goal that says we want a cooperative, rule-based, safe world that operates under the UN Charter. That's what we want. And that, I think, is the real challenge that we face. That's why I just make one basic point. The US is trying to pull Europe into the war against China. Europe is so used to following US foreign policy that it's a danger that this just happens by habit. Because Britain would do anything the US says, still. Anything. That's just a deep principle of Whitehall since roughly 1950. Never cross America. Go to Iraq? Sure, no problem. And so on. For Germany, they don't like to lead for understandable reasons. Last time they led wasn't so great. So they've been very cautious, unfortunately, not with respect to Greece's macro policy, but with respect to foreign policy. So they tend to not want to challenge the US. But this is the time to say to the US, no more Cold Wars. It's not in Europe's interest. And to be very clear about that. And by the way, it would have been time, and it still is the time, for Europe to say to the US, no sanctions on Iran. We're not going to obey your sanctions policy. We will fight you every step. Because the US is trying to crush a country, and it's, of course, as usual, leading to dangers of new war, completely against Europe's interest. But Europe doesn't have the foreign policy voice yet to say, we stand on our own. Of course, we want to be friends with the US, but we also have an independent foreign policy. So I think that this is just important with respect to China. Finally, on robots. I have a slightly different view. It's almost Aristotle's view. I'd be interested to hear his opinion, frankly, on this. Aristotle arrives at, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says that, of course, you need a certain level of wealth so that you can have the independence to be able to think. And then he, in the last book of the Nicomachean Ethics, asks, what is the best of all best lives? So the whole book is about living a good life, but then he says, what's the best life? And he considers two kinds of lives. One is the life of action in politics. He says that's a very good life. That's a life of citizenship. That's a life of dynamics. The other life is the life of contemplation. Andreas Papandreou did both. George Papandreou does both. You do both, and this is, I think, quite wonderful. But what he says is, you need a certain amount of leisure for contemplation. So I'm looking forward to the time when the robots really do all the work. I don't think we should search for jobs. I think we should search for the coffee house. And if the robots are doing our work for us, we should go have a nice coffee together. And I actually mean it in the following sense.
But you need to earn some money
Ah.
to be able to have the coffee.
Think of the thought experiment that the robots really do all the work. Then the only real question is who owns the robots. So there are two issues then, and there are two possibilities. One, Mr. Bezos owns all the robots. Then we don't even have money for a cup of coffee. Then we starve, and we're the slaves of Amazon. Or we own all the robots. They do all the work. They deliver the e-books, they deliver everything else, and we then do go have the cup of Freddo cappuccino, which is the best coffee in the world, your coffee here, by the way. Also, that's tested in about 100 countries around the world. So, the serious issue, I think, with the robots, one major serious issue is income redistribution. We cannot let Mr. Bezos off with his $110 billion in his bank account, which he has this morning. $110 billion. And that's why I'm supporting Bernie Sanders, who's saying we're going to tax that at least 8% a year. That's a good start. And that would raise, in that case, about $9 billion a year from Mr. Bezos, which could save a lot of children's lives around the world, by the way, just that small amount of money. And so the robots we want, as long as we don't empower them to do crazy things, as long as we're not turning this into robotized war, but rather the hard physical labor. I want the robots going down into the mines, because that's terrible work, and the back-breaking labor, and the tedious labor, and the repetitive labor. And there's some kinds of work that we're going to want to do even if we're not paid, because that's the value of our lives. The caring work, the creative work, the artistic work, the research work, that we would do if we have our basic income. We'd be happy to do that along the side, because what a better way to spend our day. But I am looking forward to more time at the coffee shop too.
Yes, Alexandra would like to have a question, and then I'll follow.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Professor Sachs, and particularly for the last point, which I particularly appreciated. I would like to go back to your point about our country could play a role, leading role. I would add, should play a leading role. And in that context, I would like to share with you a citizen initiative that has started from Greece, and more particularly from Delphi in the last 3 years. We call it the World Human Forum. And we believe that we could disrupt both Davos with the World Economic Forum, as well as Porto Alegre with the World Social Forum, because we believe that we need a third space now. And in that context, the idea, of course, is to put the human at the heart of it, obviously, because we believe that change is coming now from the grassroots, and it's coming everywhere. But the point I want to make has to do with the role of education. And in that context, we are thinking about creating in Delphi something we would call the Delphi Academy of the Future. And why do we call it the Delphi Academy of the Future? Because we have this idea that we need a place where the two AIs would meet. Now, obviously, we all know what the first AI is, artificial intelligence, but we believe that there is another AI, and that should be ancestral intelligence. And if we talk about ancestral intelligence, and you said a lot about everything you can find in Greece, we would easily integrate there China, obviously, India, obviously, indigenous cultures. I'm afraid the US would not have a big part to play, neither would Germany, but that's okay. You know, so if we do that, and if we have a place where ancestral intelligence meets artificial intelligence, then maybe we would get to wisdom. So I would like to know what you think of that idea.
I think that idea is absolutely splendid, and I want to sign up right away. First, the World Human Forum is fantastic. I'll tell you my personal Davos saga, which is I went for a number of years way back when, as it was starting. And then I brought Sonia, my wife. She came 2 times, the last time being 26 years ago, and said, I'm never going back again. So I've had to suffer the slippery, icy streets, the meetings, and a lot of pretension that does not contribute to world happiness, unfortunately. And so I could not agree with you more. For a humane alternative and a forum that puts humanity at the center, because the CEOs put themselves at the center all the time, and a lot of congratulating themselves about how well the world is running or not running, a lot of talk about the quarterly GDP, but not really solving any of our problems. And so I'm a huge fan of that idea. And I am profoundly, radically in agreement with you on the idea of bringing, I thought you were going to say ancient intelligence, ancestral intelligence with artificial intelligence, but we need to bring, I think for me, what I've really, what you do viscerally feel is there's nothing ancient about the ancient wisdom. It is completely pertinent, relevant, up to date, and inspiring to read, because it was grappling with the deepest questions by the most brilliant minds. And so, for me, I'll tell you a story which I shouldn't tell you, but I will tell you anyway, which is that when I got to Harvard 47 years ago as a freshman, I wanted to study government. And I wanted to be a mathematical political scientist. Because in high school I started to, I liked mathematics and I wanted to be a mathematical political scientist. So I went to the government department and I said I want to study government. And they said, fine, the first course is on the history of political thought. And I said, no, I want to take some math classes. And they said, no, you take history of political thought. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So I went across the hall to the economics department. And they didn't have any requirement of history of anybody's thought. They just had math classes. So I exactly jumped in the most precise way to mathematics and learning the tools. And it took me, it took me a long time to come back to the more basic philosophical questions. But I realized it took me a long time, embarrassingly long, decades long. I was doing policy work. I read very widely and extensively, a lot of history, but I did not go back to read the classics, and I didn't understand. And then, of course, I don't remember exactly how or when this moment, but when I went back to start reading Aristotle, oh, it was like being in a warm bath. So comfortable, unbelievable. And it's just saying to my wife, look at this, it's so wonderful, it's so wonderful. And it is wonderful. And then, as I've gotten more and more engaged in this over the last decade, I'm very much of the view that modern neuroscientific findings are amplifiers of Aristotelian thought. A lot of his ideas about human emotions, the soul, decision-making, proheuresis, choice, actually are confirmed by the most latest neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. So a fascinating thing for your project would be to put the neuroscientists together with the, and this is what we are doing, and actually at the Vatican in a couple of weeks I have a meeting of, including Professor Viridakis here, one of your great philosophers of Aristotle, and you guys coming with neuroscientists on exactly this theme. So there's a richness to it that is immediate, not only nice to know, but absolutely applicable. And so I'm 1,000% in favor. And I think Greece, take this wisdom to the world and also bring it to your young people in the schools so that they really feel the heritage. But not just heritage that, okay, I've got to study ancient Greek today, how boring, but that this is absolutely modern problem solving today, now, completely relevant. And we were talking about this in the last couple of days. Sorry, I could go on for hours about this, but if you ask a student in class today in Greece, what does eudaimonia mean for you? What do you think Aristotle means for a good life? That is a great opener for a year-long exploration for a 15-year-old. That's not boring. That's what they want to talk about. That is the best thing they want to talk about. And so I think you could bring this to the young people in the most exciting way about their lives, not about the history of Greece, but about their lives. And get in a little history along the way, it won't hurt. But that's what I think the whole world needs. And there is a little bit, but not enough. I'm reading a book right now by a wonderful Confucian scholar on a deep comparison of Confucius and Aristotle. And that kind of comparative work, and Buddhism, Confucianism, Plato and Aristotle, it's an extraordinarily rich discussion for the 21st century. So there's really something big to do with that.
Let me, if I can, just add something. There's recently been an initiative by the Greek government, actually started by the previous government, but headed now by the present government, on climate change and making Greece essentially a hub on climate change and cultural heritage.
Yes.
Both in terms of material and cultural heritage, but also in terms of ideas, in terms of wisdom and so forth. So I think that links very closely. Nina Lupo, who's here, is playing a very critical role from the ministry. And both George and Jeff played a fundamental role in promoting this at the level of the United Nations. I want to thank you here. I think it ties in very much with what you've just been saying.
Well, it's such a great initiative, and Professor Zerfos, who heads the academy, what a genius, by the way, and he's one of the world's leading climatologists and meteorologists, and played a great role in saving us from ozone depletion. And he's got an incredibly deep and incisive scientific methodology to understand the risks to the pyramids, to the Acropolis, to Venice, to the cultural heritage sites of the world. And this initiative, I think, is not only vital for protecting these sites, but is vital for helping the world to understand what we're at risk of losing if we're not paying attention, because it's everything. And so it's a fantastic initiative, and it won the hearts of the world right away. Everybody got it immediately, and so I think it's going to make a huge contribution.
Do we have any more questions? I think maybe we can take a couple, but yeah, a couple and that's it. Okay.
Thank you. Before I ask anything, I would like to tell you that I'm rather thrilled to be here. I've read two of your books which really opened new horizons for me. The one was How to End Poverty, and the other was the Price of Our Civilizations. The Commonwealth is on my reading list. Now I have a second on my reading list. So my question would be, you described a rather bleak situation where we have globalized economies, but not that much internationalist politics. This actually means that if we want to regulate the globalized economies, we need to envision a new forum, a new institution that can actually do that. So my question would be, do you actually believe that the UN could transform into that institution? And a follow-up question would be that if yes, what would be the character of this transformation? I mean, for me as a young person, it would be imperative to see a democratic transformation, to see the people participating in the decision-making processes, not just the governments, because the governments are already a step too far away from the people. So UN is two steps further, and our policies are just as strong as the weakest link in the chain. And in order to empower that link, we actually need to make it part of the chain. We need to make sure that every single one of us understands that it is part of this whole political process, and it's also and actually every single one of us can change things. Thank you.
Great. One more question.
I also thank you very much for a very inspiring talk, and also for the opportunity to have this talk, so for the organization. I'm an educator outside of other hats, but I feel an educator. So I'm concerned about the following. We have these significant environmental problems, we know it. We need significant changes, we also know it. How are we going to change? You talked about cooperation, and I think this is essential. But this also means cultural changes. We really have a very strong, at least in the Western societies, a very strong individualistic ethic, which underlines everything, from the economy to the education itself, how it is organized. How is it possible to really change this, and change this fast enough so we can have the desired change to really manage to deal with the limiting factors and tipping points that are here, okay? And one issue, another issue, this also goes hand in hand with the power inequalities that exist. Because it's, okay, the Western societies are like this, but we know that there are societies that do not have an individualistic ethic, but they don't have the power. We don't even know them, right? So how is it possible in this world, with these power inequalities, and with this very strong individualistic ethic, to really talk about not only cooperations, but really what sociology actually is based on one basic principle: individual problem is a social problem. Can we ever understand this in time?
Great. Thank you. So these are two questions about politics, and without burdening you with another long lecture, let me try to say succinctly a couple of points. I think that fundamentally there are two philosophies of politics in the Western world. And there are two philosophies of individuals in the Western world that go along with that. Aristotle invented political science in the politics. And for Aristotle, it was self-evident that the purpose of politics is eudaimonia for the polis. It was the virtue at the level of the polis. And he then talked about how to cultivate virtues in the citizens and how a cultivated virtue of citizens could support a more cultivated polis. Of course, he was living in a face-to-face context, and you can imagine different from our context, but I want to put that as one of the two theories of politics. The other theory of politics in the Western world was written by Machiavelli in 1513, The Prince, the first draft of The Prince. The idea of The Prince is politics is about the competition for power. The Prince does not mention happiness. He's not Aristotelian, although Machiavelli actually was a classicist in some ways, but he offered the prince actually as a trying to get a job from the Medicis, and it was how to keep power. And that is the political science we teach mostly, which is that politics is a competition of power. If it's a democratic setting, then you learn about voting behavior, coalition formation. If it's in the global arena, you have realist international relations, and so on. These are two competing visions. There's a second cognate competition of visions of human nature. So Aristotle's vision of human nature was that we're divided souls, literally, between an animal-like pursuit of pleasure or fame that can lead us to excesses, and we have a higher soul, the rational soul, which connects us with the divine, but is our reason that enables us to control our worst instincts and to behave ourselves. And so Aristotle's theory of behavior is the theory of when and how the rational part of us controls the appetitive part of us. And his idea is, don't go to excesses, you'll lose control. And so that's why the golden mean, moderation, is the essence of Aristotle's advice to Nicomachus, to his son, which is behave yourself. Yes, have money, but don't go to just be rich. And yes, be proud, but don't be reckless and vainglory, vainglorious, and be brave, but don't be foolhardy. So everything is be in the middle. It's good advice. And there are reasons from cognitive neuroscience why it's really good advice, because those excesses really are addictive, we now understand. They get our amygdalas and our mesolimbic systems really revved up, and we lose the self-control. Wealth is addictive. Power is addictive. And so if you just play, and Trump is really not to be laughed at, he's a sick man, actually. He has been addicted to bad behavior from a very, very tough father who also said there are losers and there are killers, and you should be a killer. And that was, Machiavelli for a 5-year-old, which is a terrible thing to tell a 5-year-old. But that was how he was brought up. So that's, sad, except even sadder that he became president, because then it's sad for us too. So this is, now, the other theory of human nature is a British philosophical view that started with Hobbes, and Hobbes was like Machiavelli at the human level, human nature level. He said people are insatiable in their greed, in their lust for power, in their desire for fame. So the only way that people don't kill each other is if there's a strong government holding them down. So he wrote a book called The Leviathan, which said only the Leviathan can stop the brutish, solitary, short life which exists outside of the civil state. It's a very negative view of humanity. Basically, it's Trump's view. There are killers and there are losers, and I'd rather be a killer than a loser. So, what is the answer? The answer actually is Aristotle was right. He didn't promise that everyone loves each other, so he didn't say human beings are saints. I don't like those books that say, you know, just express your inner compassion. Yeah, we have inner compassion, but we have the other side too. And it takes a lot to suppress your bad instincts as well. So the idea that psychology plays a role in how societies operate, I believe, is right, and that it's not a foregone conclusion. There's plenty of psychological evidence, by the way, of exactly the kind that Andreas Papandreou experimented with in the 1950s that are now experimented with, of asking, can people learn to trust each other? Under what circumstances are they trusting, and so forth? The answer is it all depends on context. And you can cultivate cooperation, especially if you're cooperative, you elicit cooperation from the other, naturally. It's called conditional cooperation. That's why if we're nasty to China, we're going to have a Cold War and say, you see what terrible people they are? But if we're nice, we're going to actually elicit cooperation from them. So we need to imbue young people with the psychology, definitely. We don't just say, yeah, people are just ruthless. They're not ruthless, they can be ruthless, but they also can learn to cultivate better behavior. And it turns out the other proposition now widely demonstrated is if you can learn to cultivate self-control, sophrosyne in ancient Greek, temperance, you're happier actually as well if you can delay gratification. So this is actually a good recipe at a social virtue level and at an individual virtue level. That's why I think it's not just flaky words, it's actually operational design issues. Can we get there? We have to get there. We have to use this wisdom, and we have to understand that it's not wrong for the state, by the way, to get into values. It's not wrong for government to teach values in schools, but what values? We have to teach good values. And there, I would say, the good ancient Greek values of phronesis, practical wisdom, of courage, Andrea, of temperance, sophrosyne, and of justice, diakazany, I think, but I forgive my pronunciation, are the right virtues to teach. And so we can actually even take the virtues from the Nicomachean Ethics and use those in to talk with students or play out real social dilemmas that they're facing and help to understand that. So I wouldn't give up on that, but I do think it's the right approach. And then finally on globalized politics, I'll finish here. All these problems of cooperation happen at all different levels. Can countries cooperate with each other? Of course they can. Look at Europe today versus Europe 80 years ago. It's a completely different Europe. And that was cultivated by Jean Monnet and by other leaders who foresaw the benefits of a community that then became a union. This is a cultivation of ideas. The United States isn't playing ball right now because the view of US foreign policy, really taken over from the view of British policy, is that the world is safe when the US is the hegemonic power, to use another good Greek word. This is not a good idea anymore. This was a reasonable idea in 1945 when the US was 40% of world output, the only economy left standing, a democracy, and it did a lot of wonderful things. But like all empires, it also let power get to its head. And so the US has been engaged in dozens of wars of choice, overthrows of government, including in this country, in participating in that disastrous episode, in overthrows of democracies in Latin America, the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, because it also has an imperial mentality. It's completely self-destructive. We just wasted $7 trillion in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Stupidest waste of money imaginable. And that was under presidents of both parties. So it's deep, it is deeper than this problem. But I want us to look past the US as leader to the idea of cooperating regions in the world, because that's what I think is really needed. Europe as a region, Africa as a region, South Asia as a region, East Asia as a region. Not regions divided on both sides, but regions cooperating, and then the regions geometrically cooperating with each other. So it's a little simpler than 193 countries with 193 times 192 over 2 bilateral relations. But it's maybe 6 major regions that have decent relations with each other. Each one with some nuclear weapons, by the way, though we want to get those numbers down to almost nothing, so that those regions aren't attacking each other as well. And then life under the structure of the UN Charter. The UN Charter essentially says you're not allowed to go to war except in self-defense. Everything else has to go through the Security Council. You're not allowed to even threaten another country, which Trump does almost daily. I will destroy you if you don't follow. That's illegal by international law. It's also vulgar. It's also worse when it comes in a tweet. Whoever imagined that politics would be done in a tweet? Geopolitics of life and death. But we need that kind of regional cooperation. Now, the UN is not exactly organized for this because it's organized at the nation-state level. And we need to evolve. But the idea of the UN Charter and the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as founding principles for global cooperation are correct. And very, very important in my mind. And when it comes to citizen participation, like you were talking about, look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says the right to participate. China's a signatory to that. Every country's a signatory to that. It doesn't mean it's going to happen from one day to the next, but it means it is our normative principle to work towards. Less threats and more convincing that this is the safe, prudent way for everybody is the way to get there, in my view. Threats will not get us there. To say, you're not doing this, because, by the way, Jesus also had a very good idea, which is, why are you pointing to the mote in the other person's eye when you have the beam in your own eye? Every time I hear an American foreign policy authority point the finger at China, all that comes to my mind is 20 American abuses. Why don't you mention those, my fellow citizen? So we shouldn't point fingers at others. We should point fingers at ourselves. We should say how bad we are, we need to do better. Why don't you look yourself and how you could do better? That's the way we could get to a safer world. Thank you.
We have one more question here. Okay. We'll make an exception here.
I'll make it as a person and not as a member of the government. I'm a little bit mixed. Your proposal is a United States of America that will not be hegemonic, as you said. Very nice word. Yesterday, in Athens, there was a demonstration outside of the American embassy. The demonstration was against President Trump's decision to put out the troops from Syria. The people that demonstrated yesterday, some years ago, would demonstrate outside of the American embassy because of the United States going to Syria. So this president is taking the troops away and making the United States less hegemonic. Is he doing right or wrong? Now the second question. Sorry to say. You had a marvelous speech. Ηθικά κομμάτια is a marvelous book. Ηθικά ευδήμια also. But I have a real concern. You said many things about the President of the United States with very hard words. You will go back to the United States and continue your life in Columbia University. If your name were Jean Jun Lee and you were talking here about against President Xi, could you go back to China and continue your life in a university in China at the same way? Do you think? And if not, don't you think it's a real danger if all our technology is in a country that doesn't have the same idea about freedom? Is there no danger in that at all? I would really like to understand.
Thank you very much. Trump is doing the right thing wrong. So the idea of getting out of Syria is absolutely right. The way that he's doing it is absolutely wrong. And that is the big problem with the US. We should never have been in Syria to begin with. It started in 2011 with Obama and Hillary Clinton wanting to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. We should not be overthrowing other people's governments, period. Period. And Assad was not committing genocide. He was a repressive dictator. That's different. We created a bloodbath in Syria. Stupid, predictably wrong. I was against it every day since President Obama said Assad must go. You should understand I'm not a partisan in this way. I do not like aggressive American foreign policy. Now, Trump absolutely disdains the United Nations. And what we needed last week was the UN. We needed a process, not one day pull out American troops and let Erdogan put in his army, but a process of pacification of Syria, which is feasible. It's actually in everybody's interest. One interest, by the way, that it is in is Assad's interest, because he will remain the leader of Syria. But by the way, that's how it's going to be for a while. And that's just how we should accept it and have accepted it during the last 8 years, as a matter of fact. The reason we don't do it the right way is that American pride says we can't accept Assad there. So we have to continue to not have any negotiated approach. And so people continue to die in large numbers. And I think the American unity attacking Trump for pulling out troops is a nonsense, because it shows how militarized both parties are. But I think Trump is a terrifyingly nasty and incompetent person. I'll say it again. He is. I know. He's dangerous, so I'm not saying it as a game, by the way. It's not comfortable for me to say it, even though I'm a professor at Columbia University. It doesn't help me. I'm not saying it as a game. I'm saying it to try to convey a serious message, that we have a mentally unstable leader, which we do. And that's a danger for the world, because he has 6,400 nuclear warheads at his command, because he plays with other countries absolutely inappropriately, because he is completely corrupt, even to put the G7 in his hotel. Come on! It's unbelievably gross that there's not even, but he doesn't have a smidgen of self-control. So I'm not playing a game by this. Could a Chinese person say it? No way. They would be arrested. Absolutely. I am not attacking the United States free speech. I'm criticizing the President of the United States. And I absolutely am criticizing the President of the United States, maybe at some risk, by the way, though small. but because I feel that this is extremely dangerous for us. Sonia?
He's asking you about the democracy of China.
No. But he's also saying, I think, why do you attack the U.S. so much?
No.
Oh, no. Okay. No. So in that sense, maybe just to understand then, thank you. In that sense, yes, I think China should have more openness. I hope they do. And I think that they can, but not if we're pounding on China, playing games. Now, this comes to the Huawei question. Am I afraid of Huawei? No.
I have a Huawei phone.
Yeah, okay. Am I afraid of Huawei? I am not afraid of Huawei. Am I afraid of the US government putting backdoors in any system? Absolutely. If Edward Snowden taught us anything, is my government's listening. Period. And by the way, we have laws that give them laws. They're kind of the secret laws of the Patriot Act that give them the right to listen. And when I said once recently to an intelligence expert, I said, you know, every time I make an international call, I feel that they're listening to me. He said, Jeff, you are so ridiculous. At least 6 countries are listening to you. and I'm sure that that is correct. And by the way, you can't have a conversation almost anywhere that you expect to be private, because everything, I'm afraid of, you know, when you're in foreign policy terms, is being monitored and listened to. Fortunately, there's so much that, you know, if you really count for much, it doesn't matter. But the point is that I'm not especially afraid of Huawei at all on this. What I am afraid of is if the United States, I think Huawei, by the way, just got there first. They got to 5G low cost first. And that's driving the US crazy, because Ericsson and Nokia are 2, 3, 4 years behind and more expensive. And the US doesn't have one 5G producing company, not one. So this is because we're incompetent. This was known to be coming, but we don't have one. And so that's the game. This is just industrial policy as far as I'm concerned. And if there was a shred of evidence, we would have seen a shred at least. The US hasn't produced one shred of evidence anywhere. It said the risks are too high. Come on, do better than that. Even the British, who are slavishly attached to the US foreign policy, have said we can't find any risks at all. Even the Germans can't find any risks at all. It doesn't mean they'll deviate from the United States, because the United States threatens to cut them out of the Five Eyes program. But nobody finds it. So am I worried? I'm not worried. What I am worried about is Peter Navarro, who is the advisor in the White House, who says every time we buy a good from China, we're just helping China take over the world. We're funding the People's Liberation Army. That's what terrifies me, that kind of idea, because that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what gets us into a self-fulfilling arms race. To use another great Greek author, you know, it's now been christened the Thucydides trap, of course, by Graham Allison. The idea that the Peloponnesian Wars was a self-fulfilling arms race between Sparta and Athens. And Graham Allison wrote a wonderful book saying it doesn't have to be that way, but it has a tendency to become that way. And I know, because I follow American foreign policy day to day, that a lot of this is deliberate containment ideas. Contain China. Absurd, in my view. How can 4% of the world's population say we're going to contain 20% of the world's population? It's a nasty idea, not a good, prudent idea, but it's also a ridiculous idea. It falls in the same column, to me, as when Barack Obama said Assad must go. I was on a television show that day on Morning Joe, And he made the statement, and Joe Scarborough looked at me and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think it's absurd. How's he going to get him to go? What does he mean?" And of course, it turned out not just to be absurd, it turned out to be deadly. Deadly for Europe also, because your refugee crisis came from America's decision to overthrow Assad. And almost no one in Europe ever dared to say it, because no one likes to talk bad about the United States. But the fact of the matter is, the whole refugee crisis in 2015 was American caused in 2011. We shouldn't have such wars, these wars of choice. So Trump is right, but what a dumb way to do it. And if he had gone to the Security Council, and said, the Kurds need to disarm, which we should never have armed them, by the way, the same way, because that was another cynical action. Erdogan said in 2014, don't arm the Kurds. Erdogan was right. The last thing Turkey needed was armed Kurds on their southern border, massively armed by the United States. Erdogan warned it correctly. Americans don't listen. Crazy. Okay, so 5 years later, we're facing exactly the problem that Erdogan rightly warned us about in 2014. But the way to do this would have been the Security Council, because Putin is interested in getting Americans out, Trump is interested in getting Americans out, Assad is interested in getting Americans out. We should have disarmed the Kurds, because frankly, arming the Kurds is not fair game either for Turkey or for Syria. So the Kurds should have been told, you're standing down, you're disarming, and you're leaving the region if you have come in from the outside. And finally, Assad, it's your country. It's not your country, it's your government. You take over this area. That last piece is what blocks the US, because that's losing. And in American politics, you're not allowed to lose. So that's why they're also fighting, because they're telling Trump, you are a loser. Because in American foreign policy, when you're the empire, you're not allowed to remove a piece from the board. If you play the game of risk, you never give up a piece on your board. The American mentality is never leave troops once they've come in.
But he's taking them back.
No. So that's why he's being attacked, is what I'm saying.
But he still takes them back.
He's right. But not for a bloodbath. Go to the UN, Mr. Trump. Learn something about cooperation. That's all.
Okay, let me say this is. I think we could all easily be addicted to what Jeff Sachs has to say, and this conversation could go on forever. And I think it's one case in which Aristotle's view on moderation, he's okay with binging on wisdom. Okay, so and for that reason we have a president that's related to this idea of wisdom, and we'd like to offer to you, which has it's Picasso inspired, it's private museum that has ancient Greek cultural history, modern art, and wisdom at the heart. Thank you very much.